Welcome everyone to this session with Filipino activists and scholars where we talk about making public services work for people. My name is Sharmila Parmanand. I'll be chairing this panel. I am currently a gender and human rights scholar at the London School of Economics. So what this panel does is we foreground research undertaken by Filipino scholar activists to understand and measure the extent to which public services are working for vulnerable segments of the Philippine population, such as the urban poor, formal and informal workers, and ordinary commuters. So there are 4 speakers in this panel, and I'm just going to introduce all of them now with a brief summary of what they'll be talking about, and then they'll start speaking one after the other. So our first speaker, Maria Carmen Fernandez, or Ika, is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. So Ika is presenting a group research findings from a group research that discusses community mapping with 2 urban poor areas in Metro Manila, which includes the pandemic in its time frame. So majority of the people that they worked with are urban poor, informal sector, or near poor, and these populations are often invisible in government service delivery, often ineligible for social protection. And so Ika will also be reflecting on on avenues for participatory governance. The second set of speakers are from Move as One Coalition, which is a coalition of 150 organizations fighting for safe, human, and inclusive public transport in the Philippines. We have Reycel, Hyacenth, Bendaña, Haya, and Joshua Mata, who is the Secretary General of a collective of labor unions. Together, will be discussing specific advocacies to increase the negotiating position of workers vis-a-vis their employers, such as pushing for better contracts and working conditions. And our last speaker, Ken Abante, is a collective impact organizer with the WeSolve Foundation. Ken is also a coordinator of Move as One Coalition. They are also a research faculty member at the Ateneo de Manila University, where they study public finance and budgeting and its intersection with collective action movements. So Ken today will be discussing findings from a research that they did with a team where they studied the Philippine government budget and audit documents over the past decade to understand how infrastructure and public transport budget priorities may have a massive may lead to a massive transportation shortage, and so outlines the ways in which public transport can be democratized. So each set of speakers will speak for 15 minutes. Afterwards, we will open for questions. I'd just like to remind everyone in the venue that this is being recorded and will be published after. All right, happy to turn over to Ika.
Okay, let me try to share my screen. A moment. I hope this works. Is it visible?
Can see, yes.
Yep.
All right. Great. Okay, so good evening from Manila. My name is Ika. What I'll be sharing for this session is collaborative work done as urbanismo.ph, a loose collective of development practitioners working on tricky issues in Philippine cities. So one thing we've been doing as Urbanismo for the last few years is looking at multidimensional vulnerability, meaning how people in low-income, informal neighborhoods are vulnerable to constant cycles of environmental crisis, such as flooding, fires, demolitions, but also human-induced disasters, crimes, and extrajudicial killings, including those experienced by families under the Duterte's drug war, which is also now being reviewed by several international bodies. And now we have a ongoing slow burn disaster in the form of the COVID-19 pandemic, which started in March of last year, but has not really ended, not for Southeast Asia, which is now the epicenter of the Delta variant. And the Philippines has been having one of the harshest lockdowns in the world. We've never really left it since March. So what I'll be sharing now is actually research done by Urbanismo, which began in February of 2020, in 2 urban neighborhoods in Metro Manila, particularly in Pasig, which is recently elected the young progressive mayor, but nevertheless has its own share of problems. And we're focusing on the experiences of these neighborhoods which are defined by the local government as so-called pockets of poverty. No, and by that I mean the local city government has identified a number of households which are sandwiched within more highly more less impoverished, more high income areas. No, so just for those not familiar with the Philippine data system, the lowest, the smallest level of admin data available is the barangay, but what we're talking about here are more smaller pockets or clusters at the neighborhood level, closer to a zip code, for example. But this kind of admin, spatial, or technical data does not exist formally. And so part of the work which the local government asked us to do was to help them map out, find these families in order to ensure better service delivery. Because even the social workers and engineers of this highly urbanized and affluent city could not find these households. No, and then COVID happened. And so our approach, no, given the current situation, was to completely adjust our methods in order to map out the urgent emerging health, livelihood, and other needs to respond to the requirements of these pockets of poverty. And so what I'll be sharing is, I guess, findings from an iterative process we've been doing over the last 1.5 years. Very much driven by participatory mapping and community dialogue methods. But ultimately, beyond analysis, how do you now use this process to surface invisible realities and help the communities, be able to advocate for themselves to get the services they need? So from what we had sorted out in 2017, which is mapping out drug war killings, in these alleyways and slums, these same areas became the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic. Although the reality is, back in early 2020, COVID was then the illness of the rich and the mobile. But now, it's these urban poor communities that are not able to leave their homes, despite being daily wage earners. And so our first wave of work was mapping at the more regional level, at the level of Metro Manila, in order to work with the private sector to inform the delivery of food aid. This at the time where government had not been able to mobilize and pass coronavirus legislation yet. And this is also the time that the private sector still had money to burn. This was like one particular moment in time which worked. And so this kind of possibility of using mapping for directing aid became a deeper process with two neighborhoods who realized the value of being visible. That visibility at this point during a pandemic is equal to survival, to be able to be eligible for ayuda. And so we looked at two sites. The first one was Napico, which is a urban poor reform community, dating back to the Marcos, just after the Marcos era. Although some of these areas have been titled, not all of them have. The second is Nagpayong in Pinagbuhatan, a former dump site which was slowly transformed by different urban poor communities into what is now probably the densest barangay in the entire of Pasig City. And so what I'll share in a bit is the process that we went through. By asking them, what do you need, what needs to be surfaced, what needs to be visible, we identified several layers of information that needed to be analyzed and surfaced in order to tell the story of these neighborhoods, but also to address the problems which they needed their leaders, their mayor, and different agencies to be able to respond to, which had to do with health, access, mobility, communications, and of course, safety and security in different ways. Part of it was tracing the history of the place, asking them to tell the different layers of story, but also finding ways of doing this in a safe and practical manner. So part of it was on Zoom and Facebook Messenger, and some of it before Delta hit was face-to-face. So I'll spend the next 10 minutes sharing about the findings, and we don't have much time to delve into it, but these are fascinating because what we were able to do together was to be able to sketch out the physical and relational form of these neighborhoods from the point of view of the residents. And so the first layer had to do with understanding how these urban spaces evolve. No, many of the spaces that we described don't appear on the map. It speaks of a very organic process where from dump sites or what you call talahiban, or where you had basically blank undeveloped land. No, you have communities slowly building them up, even creating streets where there had not been before, which don't appear in any of in your Google Maps or any of formal local government atlases. And so there is that narrative where different waves of resettlement and demolition create a dynamic where you have urban poor families, very active and powerful in shaping their neighborhood, that at the same time are in between this state of visibility and invisibility. And so it's an interesting process of discussion. No? But in terms of the COVID pandemic, this kind of informality is a complete issue, because these areas are very dense. It's a place where you don't have enough access to street lighting, water sanitation, or other frontline services. Even the basics of ventilation and physical distancing are impossible in many of these families. No, and so you also have this unevenness of development in the area, where you have more informal houses. Beside more upscale, well, not necessarily upscale, but more developed communities where people have been more economically mobile. Of course, as we discussed, the way that these species are shaped, the pandemic is front and center of this reality. And so a lot of the discussions had to do with how the pandemic shaped the way they understood their neighborhood and they treated their neighbors. So, and unfortunately, a lot of the community members there, the fear, of course, there was fear about the pandemic, but it also shaped the way they trusted their communities, the way they trusted their neighbors. And people honestly didn't want to be isolated, given that isolation means losing days of income that they could not afford. And so primarily the question wasn't about will I get COVID, but will I be able to feed my family today and for the next couple of weeks. So what we were able to surface through the mapping was the patterns of access and non-access at the level of the city, but also at the level of the street. So this map, for example, on the right shows general patterns of economic activity, where you have more affluence and services on the left-hand side of the city, whereas our sites on the right-hand side are very much are isolated from many of the frontline services required, which leads to issues around food security. Many of our families we work with were either classified as poor or near poor, and not all of them were able to access food or financial aid. And so many of them try to survive through online selling, by selling food and other services through Facebook and Viber. The food security issues we discussed had a lot to do with issues of mobility. Especially during the first year of COVID-19, you had a heavy and very militarized approach to mobility, and so you had checkpoints everywhere, which raised cost of travel. And so, especially for our respondents whose husbands were jeepney drivers, they were forced out of work amidst the shutdown and the monetization program, which created so many layers of issues for these families. Another part of the discussion had to do with mapping out access to cellular services, which since their kids, right now, for the last year and a half, no face-to-face schooling has started in the Philippines, and so everything is online. And the maps on the right show you that most of the cell sites and signal are available again on the more affluent left-hand side of the city, whereas our areas on the right-hand side have limited cellular signal. And so you have different coping mechanisms that the families had to deal with, including the rise of what we call piso nets, or internet connection hotspots, where people pay 1 peso coins per minute in order to access and survive. At the end of the day, a lot of our discussions circled around how people perceive safety and security in the time of pandemic, and that had to do with flooding, fires, and as well as the ongoing drug war, which never really stopped despite the lockdowns. No, and interestingly, even as we were mapping this out, no, several typhoons hit the same communities in the last quarter of 2020, and so a lot of it had to do with again mapping out the different issues that families here in these areas had to deal with to survive. That you were still dealing with the lockdowns, you were still dealing with the lack of jobs while your house was flooded out, and while your kids who were not able to go to school are now being drawn towards gangs, no, given the lack of things to do. And we had stories where the few kids who were able to afford cell phones to go to class would have their phones stolen from their hands by snatchers who in the street. So these were things that we were able to process, no? And so the wonderful thing about it is that the communities themselves were able to use this data to advocate for changes, no? On the right, the image is their first presentation to the mayor of the city, and so they identified key issues like transport and connectivity, which the local government was able to address within its own budget automatically. And there are other issues like youth insecurity and the gang issues and livelihood, which the different neighborhood networks are now planning out strategies to address. So it's an interesting exercise, no? And it's what it shows you certain things about the safety and security during a pandemic. No? It shows you about how there's a sizable gap between data of Philippine government, but also realities of the ground. At the same time, there's a gap between what we think of as safety and security, when in fact right now, human rights issues are the least of people's concerns right now. What safety is ensuring that you have food on the table, you have income coming in every day, and that your kids will have mobile load to go to school. No, however, a major part of this is not just the physical aspects of safety and security, but also the social fissures which are emerging. And so many were saying that tactics and dynamics which were started with the drug war are continuing with COVID-19, where you had the use of excessive force. You have residents now less willing to condole with neighbors and relatives affected with COVID-19. And so there were a lot of debates regarding discrimination, no, against overseas migrant workers and nurses, no, forcing LGUs to issue ordinances about this, no, including people being more willing to identify neighborhoods or blocks in their streets as safe or unsafe. However, you have that push and pull between those fissures, but also the tendency of neighbors to come together to survive, no, where the homeowners associations were responsible for making sure that people were fed, that people had income, including the rise of community pantries toward the early part of this year, where people were able to contribute food for neighbors who had less to eat. And so what this exercise is telling us is that a responsive service delivery in times of crisis requires a deep contextual understanding of spaces and places, which are often invisible in standard government procedures. No? So it's a challenge of doing this kind of foregrounding, privileging from the ground that goes beyond the top-down militarized framework that you often see in most government and disaster-related public service delivery, which also will need to include the more invisible linkages of transport, mobility, and communications, which now create and shape our realities right now with COVID. We are having this discussion online.
I think we may have lost Ika for a bit. Okay, Ika, I am gonna press pause on this, and then we can come back to some of these themes in the Q&A, because we will have a lot of time for that. Also, because I think Ika's dropped for a bit. And I'm now just gonna say, let's move on to Haya and Joshua first, and revisit Ika after.
Thanks, Sharmila.
Thank you. And Haya and Joshua, you both don't have PowerPoint, right?
Wala po. Ay, sorry,
Okay.
we don't.
Okay, then let's just go. I'll message Ika privately.
Go, kuya.
think Joshua might also be frozen. I mean, such is the state of our internet connection in the Philippines. Haya, do you think you could go first? Would that be okay to just switch the order? Yeah, we've lost Joshua. It's too loud.
I think he's entering, ate.
Okay.
He's entering. We can have him first there.
All right, there he
He's
is.
back.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Okay,
do
cool.
you get me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Where was I? So I was about to say, I was saying that the labor movement in the Philippines has managed to, it has for quite some, in a big way. In fact, the labor movement, constitution, workers' collective bargaining rights, the right to organize, the right to strike, even. And we were the first among ASEAN countries to actually ratify all the ILO core conventions. So, we've done a lot as a labor movement. The problem, however, is that there's still a lot of things that we need to do in order to fully liberate the workers from the shackles of poverty and powerlessness that many workers are still experiencing in the country. After all, the membership of the wage and salaried workers. But to give you a better sense of the kind of coverage that the trade union movement have, we only have about 250,000 workers who are actually covered by collective bargaining agreements. And that says a lot, in terms of the challenges that the labor movement is facing. So one of the things that because of this, one of the major issues that we are facing is the major challenges that we're facing has to do with democratizing work. The truth is, 35 years after we kicked out the Marcos dictatorship, democracy is once again top of our agenda. And rightly so. Not only because we're dealing with a new tyrant who's occupying our
I think we may have lost Joshua again. Haya, are you here?
Yes. Should I start?
I don't know. I guess, yeah, maybe just build on what Josh was saying, because I assume you both are on the same page, and then when we get them back, we can go back.
Yeah. Kuya Jos, are you back? I think it's much okay.
Wish.
Kuya Jos, do you want to turn off your camera and speak? It might be more helpful.
Yeah, Joshua, I
Okay.
think the last thing we heard was his discussion of Duterte returning. Yeah,
Do you want me to jump in?
I think
Okay.
we just jump in, yeah.
Okay, game. So, we had a bad government. that's really the summary. But really, okay. I think I'm a storyteller, so I'll tell 3 stories. And first story, before I begin talking about coalition organizing, the context in where Move As One organized with our transport community, I think it's important to set the context first of why the boundary system is inhumane and why I, Kuya Jos, Ken, Kuya Jaime, Kuya Erning, and many more from our transport community are working so hard to abolish it. So, I'll talk about the story of Dada, who's actually here eating pizza. So for 2 decades, he woke up at 3 in the morning to start plying the roads at 4 a.m. So from 4 a.m. to 12 noon, that's around 8 hours, he just has enough to pay the boundary, what we call in the Philippines, or the vehicle usage fee. That's 8 hours of labor. But if he goes home immediately after, he has nothing to bring home back. So he works until around 12 midnight, sometimes 1 in the morning. That's an additional 12 to 13 hours of labor to be able to bring around $16 or $20 home. That if you sum it all up, it's at least 20 hours of labor just for that amount of money, a pay way less than the minimum wage in a country of $10 for 8 hours. So the income of our transport workers is highly dependent on the number of passengers they carry, which is, by the way, a nightmare in Metro Manila traffic. So what we want and what the transport worker community wants is service contracting for our transport workers to receive guaranteed income regardless of the number of passengers they carry for a humane 8 hours of labor plus social security benefits. Second story is the story of the transport community. Before I was a student activist, actually, I was part of the community working. A lot of my family is in that sector. And I grew up exposed to the life and the problems as well. And our avenues for the past X years have really been strikes, protests, and rallies. We're the transport community is great actually in organizing individuals to come out on the streets. It's so fast. Everything when you say we're going to strike tomorrow, everything is on the streets immediately. And because of this, we've been called a nuisance to traffic. We've been called an inconvenience to the daily life of Filipino commuters, most of whom are also part of the masses whenever we demand for better welfare for our sector. Rallying in the streets was a default avenue for us to take care of our welfare. But the important thing to note is that the jeepney community, just like many of our sectors, do not actually have access to many of our democratic processes and many of our democratic institutions and are usually just shunned away as insignificant. Especially large institutions who have strong tendencies to just declare sectoral communities as negligible. And although our transport community can massively paralyze the entire economy during strikes, right? Many of our transport agencies still don't listen. Therefore, when the public transportation system was suspended in March 2020 of last year as a response to the pandemic, it was hard for us to be able to vocalize and talk about how it's affecting us. But it got extended and extended and extended. In fact, until now, many of our transport routes are still unauthorized to operate. For months, the Philippine government had no sensible plan, no social subsidies for workers affected by prolonged unemployment, and no clear communication on what's next. So our hardworking transport workers were forced to beg on the streets to feed their families. And it was hard. With the COVID-19 pandemic, even when some of the routes were opened, the requirement of physical distancing for our safety was difficult in the boundary system. Because before, if one trip will have 20 passengers times 8 pesos each, you have 160 pesos. In the pandemic world, you can only get 10 passengers, sometimes even less than that. And with 8 pesos each, you're running at a loss. So it was hard for our transport workers to recover and to make a living in the old system, and they wanted to change things. It was in this call, together with the plight of our commuters who don't have enough public transport services available to access, together with the plight of our healthcare workers who couldn't get to hospitals and save lives on time because of without public transport, and together with many of our ordinary commuters who, without public transport, are forced to walk for hours just to reach their destinations on time, or even just to reach their destinations period, or even to ride bicycles in our unsafe roads. Many of them have resulted to road crashes, and some of them even passed away. Many of our this also includes the plight of many of our siblings with disability who couldn't access critical healthcare services unless they rent a van that is 10 times the minimum wage in the Philippines. This also includes the plight of many of our workers who couldn't go to work on time and are therefore fired and who don't really have the privilege of quote unquote work from home. It is in this context that Move as One Coalition was formed and was organized as a response to the bad governance of the Philippine Republic. So we have NCTU, for example, Kuya Jos, Kuya Jaime Ka-Erning, our commuter groups, sila Kuya Julius, Madam Toix, our persons with disability, Dog Mao, our transport planners, urban planners, transport economists, youth, and many other sectoral groups came together and discussed what are our three negotiables, what are our three non-negotiables in order for us to respond to this pandemic, specifically when it comes to mobility. And we were able to come up with three. The first one is safe and protected bike lanes so that our healthcare workers can get to hospitals on time without being involved in a road crash by trucks and speeding vehicles. The second one is service contracting so that our transport workers can co-implement the physical distancing and healthcare protocols by the government without being punished for overloading and for being desperate and earning enough for their family. And the third one is better road transport services. 88% of Filipinos in the Philippines do not own cars. So when they suspended the public transportation services, it was difficult for many of them to be able to access our roads. Road transport infrastructure includes PUV-only lanes, where our commuters can reach their destinations more easily without so much, without correcting the allocation for private vehicles that should be dedicated to the majority of our masses. It was these three proposals we organized upon. And I think more than the proposals here and the budget will be discussed by Ken earlier, there were three key lessons in the organizing of Move as One that made us effective in lobbying for policies and lobbying for budget. The first one is constant consensus building. When we started, you were a mass of different groups trying to work together in the budget and creating the policy we want to create. And a critical point is that we have to create a space that is safe enough for people to bring in their opposition, to bring in their ideas and values without having to create so much contentious discussion. Contentious discussion is okay. Conflict is okay, and conflict is important for us in deciding what particular policies we should forward as a coalition. And we were able to create that space that is safe enough for people to be able to talk about what really is important in their key organizing and what are their non-negotiables. I think the key example here is how our transport workers, for example, are able to advocate for a just transition, are able to advocate for modernized fleets as well, in response to the request of our environmental advocates to phase out the old models of jeepneys that were polluting our environment. So instead of fighting against each other of, no, we're not okay with modernizing because you're going to take away our livelihood, versus we're okay with modernizing because our environment needs it. The solution for these two core groups was to talk about, you know what, we're okay with modernizing, but what we need for our livelihood is a just transition for our workers in the sector. That was the first one. And it was the first time that government received a unified messaging. It wasn't groups versus groups fighting each other for common reform, but groups working together to be able to push forward a reform that benefits everyone. Second key principle we did in organizing is to allow people and sectors to represent themselves. We don't talk in behalf of a transport worker community. We don't talk in behalf of the commuters. We don't talk in behalf of healthcare workers. They talk. If we were able to access meetings with the secretaries of transportation agencies, if we're able to talk to legislators, to senators, to Congress representatives, and if there are 5 seats, automatically majority of the seats will be given to our sectors. One for our transport sector, one for our commuters, etc., etc. The technical experts, quote unquote, aren't the ones who are mandating and dominating the conversation. We take a step back and give our sectors the right to represent themselves because they are the experts in the first place. It's not the scholars, it is not us who has studies, who has this PhD, etc., but our sectors who have been living the problem and the concerns of their sector for so long. Third, I think, is to develop a proper escalation strategy. And this is, I think, a new thing coming from someone in the streets, right? Uh, we don't go to rallies immediately. We employ a series of escalation strategy from writing letters, exhausting all options necessary before we proceed and go and make the issues public. To hold a press conference, for example, etc. There are multiple routes that we have to check off. If this route doesn't work, etc., to be able to bring these issues in the public. We understand that, for example, it's not really our sector's fault if, Mami, naririnig ka? Sorry, it's not really, sorry. We understand that it's not really our sector's fault if they go and get angry because our sectors have been historically disenfranchised and oppressed for so long. However, we believe that in order for reforms to be passed, in order for reforms to win, we have to create compromises in terms of strategy, in terms of communication, etc., and giving people who are pushing for oppressive policies a graceful way out as much as we can. And when we set up that kind of environment and when we work together, not just with government agencies and officials, with our champions in the system, we're able to push for the reforms we need. This is also a part of the story is also considering that the government is not automatically our enemy. There are a lot of friends inside government, a lot of champions who are willing to push for our causes, and they need our support. They need the critical mass, the critical voice from the masses for them to be able to tell their boss that this is a policy that's rational, and this is the policy you should listen to. And our role as civil society is to give them that push, to allow them to get that support and data so that they can lobby in behalf of us in the transport agencies that they're serving. And I think that's something that we have learned as we organize through the coalition. I have 2 minutes remaining. And to wrap it up, I think the key important message in coalition organizing are three things. The first one is really to allow the sectors to represent themselves, to allow them to talk. And to give a space that is safe enough for individuals to discuss and co-design policies, movements, and budgets together. And to be able to be open and work together with individual stakeholders, groups that may not necessarily be aligned with us first, but are willing to compromise as we push forward and create and build the better Philippines that we all envision, that we all deserve. That's it. I'll pass the mic back to Kuya Joshua.
Thank you, Haya. Joshua, just check in if you are able to jump in. No, I think we lost Joshua again. So that's okay. I think we do have some time, so we can move on to Ken. And then we'll revisit bits from Joshua and Ika after. So Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? And can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. So, good evening, good day to everyone. It is an honor to present to you a collective study of many people. We studied government budget and audit documents over the past decade to understand, key issues in the public transport sector that affect us all, especially in this pandemic. So the title of this presentation is Democratizing Public Transport Work in the Philippines, Public Financial Perspective. And this flows from Haya and Joshua's presentation on, how do we do organizing? And this perhaps is, this is common scholarship among the members of the group. This is engaged research where we really work with the sectors involved to push for the budget messages that shape our lives. I'd like to share 3 key messages tonight. The first is this context that the Philippine public transport sector is among the worst hit by the pandemic. This was the galvanizing force that allowed us to organize and push for better public transport system. Second, there is a massive shortage in public transport caused by a decades-long system of what we call car-centric public budgeting that has harmed not just car users, not just commuters and ordinary workers, but even car users as well. Even if this is what car-centric public budgeting aims to serve. And the third is people need to claim both our space in our cities, our space in our roads as public spaces, and our democratic space as citizens of the country to fight for a public transport system and budget that puts people, workers, commuters, and nature first, as opposed to just the rich few who own cars. So those are the key messages that I'll share with you tonight. The first is this harrowing statistic about jobs in transport and storage falling from a high of 3.1 million in February 2021 to 2.8 million in June 2021. 300,000 jobs were lost just over this past few months. And it's among the worst sectors in our economic records to have a deep slump in employment. So this is just the number of jobs that were lost over the past few months. This is absolutely terrible. And one of the reasons for it is because over the past few months with government has taken a position that public transport be suspended. This is a graph that shows you that there are still 15% of public utility vehicle units. So bus, jeep, and public utility vehicle express units allowed by the government as of September 24. The red line shows you the number of units that are available in a case study in Metro Manila, around 66,000. You see a large gap when the lockdown started. No public transport units were allowed. Very slowly, as we organized, we managed to convince government that public transport should be allowed. And it was because of that collective action that we were able to push that number higher. But even until now, government continues to have this position that not all public transport units should be allowed, which we think is misguided. So there's still around 10,000 utility vehicles that are not yet operating. These are 4 case studies with some transport cooperatives that we work with, which is part of our National Confederation of Transport Workers Union. Many PUVs, or public utility vehicles, have not been allowed or authorized to ply their routes. And as Hayam and Sir Joshua mentioned, many of those authorized now have difficulty providing services under this very restrictive boundary system. And this boundary system under the pandemic, where you're required to do physical distancing, where you're required to lower the number of commuters that you're allowed to carry, has really made many transport cooperatives not viable. So you see here 4 transport cooperatives, actual live cases, where even if they were allowed to operate, many still cannot because transport or public transport, specifically jeepneys, have become not viable. You see 62% of some units not operating in La Transco, 15% in Transco, Taminasca Transco, 73% of units not operating in Pitam, and 60% of this other transport cooperative not operating. Right? So again, this is another terrible statistic. This transport shortage affects not just transport workers, but commuters everywhere in the Philippines. The shortage manifests in crowded commutes and worsening COVID-19 transmission. It causes people to clump in areas and forces people to crowd, violating one of the central preventive measures in passing COVID, in preventing COVID. Now, for a long time, the solution has been to build our way out of this transport supply shortage. And the plan over this next decade is to spend a total of 2 trillion pesos, or around 50 billion, 40 billion dollars to public transport infrastructure projects, of which 98% is actually heavy rail. Just 2% is on road-based public transport, which a lot of us use, which majority of commuters use. So just 49 billion are bus rapid transits or other such road-based public transport infrastructure that's more common. And rail, while rail is good for long-term needs, because rail takes a long time to build, it's important to have a better balance towards road-based public transport that can be built much faster than rail. So that was the first key message that gives you a hint as to why this is happening in the public transport sector in the Philippines. The second key message is there's a massive shortage in public transportation caused by a car-centric public budgeting system. Even if the 2 trillion peso pipeline is built on time, we found through a study with some transport economists and urban planners, we wrote this earlier this year, that even if you construct this entire pipeline, there would still be a public transport shortage through 2030. There's around 2.8 million daily transport trips or passenger trips that are now currently in our shortage. Even if you build that 2 trillion peso pipeline, even under the most conservative assumptions of population growth, still there will be 2.8 million daily passenger trips that will be a shortage if we don't shift the way that we use our investments, right? So our current infrastructure flagship pipeline does nothing to address this shortfall. This is another paper that we wrote where we looked at audit documents over the past decade, and what we saw here is we've invested near zero in road-based public transport over the past decade because of the reliance of the Philippine government on the private boundary system. And what we saw here is that 99% of the 2.8 trillion or $50 billion road-based infrastructure budget between 2010 to 2021 went to car-centric infrastructure. So road construction, widening, and maintenance without the requisite distribution or redistribution of road space towards commuters, pedestrians, cyclists, as opposed to widening roads for cars, which does not solve traffic congestion. So we've invested only 40 billion pesos over the past 12 years. That's the 2010 to 2021 period, which is one of the central organizing and central political spaces that we want to change. This car-centric public budgeting has harmed not just car users, but commuters too. Over the past at least 7 or 8 years, public transport trips in Metro Manila's major roads have collapsed by 14%, while the average daily traffic of private vehicles, which are private motorcycles and private cars, increased by 46%. This is, the collapse of public transportation and the increase in private trips actually increased and lengthened the average daily trip time for cars, right? So you see that increasing from 1.75 minutes per kilometer, increasing to 2.5. That's a massive increase in average travel speed. And we always argue that if you want to know a politician's priorities, you don't just listen to their words that they say in speeches. We must study their budgets, which leads me to, the success indicators of these agencies that have remained car-centered or vehicle-centered. So some of these key transport agencies do not actually have a regular pedestrian count or a regular cycling count. many of the transport indicators are for optimizing vehicle speeds, which has been proven by urban economists and transport economists for a long time to be really ineffective, right? Because they even increase your road crash and road crash deaths. So again, study their budgets. Do not just listen to their words in their stump speeches. So it's clear that people need to claim both the road space and the democratic space and the budget space to fight for this public transport system that puts people and nature first. And one key idea is, redistributing what should be, say, for example, 10 lanes of cars to having better spaces, exclusive spaces for cyclists and public transport and commuter use, which leaves more urban space for plazas, housing, parks, and better green open spaces, which is needed for COVID-19 recovery. So this is what we're fighting for in Move as One. We're fighting for a mobility solutions package that is safe, humane, and inclusive. So ligtas, makatao, at para sa lahat. We're a collective of many different sectors who are fighting for a better budget. So we're not just transport economists, we're transport workers. We're the problem owners, not just the problem solvers. We have labor groups, climate justice advocates, persons with disabilities, even religious groups, youth groups, business groups, funding groups and development partners, healthcare workers, commuters, cyclists, who are pushing for this better budget. With our collective action over just this past year, if you remember that statistic where I showed you around 40 billion pesos from 2010 to 2021, around a third of that total road-based public transport spending or budget was lobbied just over this past year of collective action. So we were able to push for 12 billion pesos worth of budgets for our transport workers just over this past year of organizing. And we're not yet content with this 12 billion peso budget. We are pushing this year with a larger collective of budget advocates, 150 billion peso budget. So 50 pesos is to a dollar. We are pushing for a better budget for service contracts to make sure that 50% of our public transport fleet has better working conditions. We are fighting for a better active transport budget, not just in Manila, Cebu, and Davao, where we were able to already establish around 500 kilometers of bike lanes through a 1 billion peso budget that we were able to lobby over this past year. We want more cities to have better pop-up bike lanes. We want an upgrade from those pop-up emergency bike lanes to permanent, higher quality bike lanes that protect our cyclists and pedestrians. And bike lanes are the best response to the shortage in public transport and the need for reliable travel with physical distancing. And this is highly popular. We helped run a public opinion poll, and then 85% of Filipinos want their city and municipality to become a great place for walking and cycling. 87% of Filipinos want priority on roads for public transport, bicycles, and pedestrians over private vehicles. And we're ramping up in this 2022 election season to make sure that no politician can ignore this highly popular budget. We're optimizing the use of our bike lanes and service contract program by investing in better public transport stops so people don't have to clump and possibly get run over by vehicles because there is a lack of public transport stops in the Philippines. We're fighting for a just transition to increase the equity subsidy of our public transport workers from the current insufficient amount to an amount that gets people more supportive of the modernization program, as Haya and Sir Joshua said. This is the end of the presentation. Just allow me to backtrack on these three key messages. Again, the Philippine public transport is among the worst hit by the pandemic. There's a massive shortage in public transport caused by a system of car-centric public budgeting. And third, there's hope. People like our coalition And our partners in government and the academe have claimed both road space and democratic space to fight for a public transport system and budget that puts people and nature first. But it's very important for all of us to make these safe spaces, to democratize public transport. And one of the spaces to claim is the budget process, which is a political process and something that all Filipinos, regardless of gender, race, occupation, class, have a right to participate in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Okay, we have Ika back with us. So I think before we open for questions, and so I'd like to encourage the audience to post your questions in the Q&A. Maybe we can let Ika conclude your presentation, and if possible, also try to I guess, tease out more explicitly the participatory governance strategies that you recommended as a result of this research, if that's okay. Thanks,
Okay.
Ika.
All right. So just really quickly, what we found in our experience over the last year and a half is that there is value in working very closely with local communities to be able to surface their own data, to package their own data, and to support them in using that information to advocate for themselves. And these kinds of strategies have the use of different participatory methods to document invisible spaces, both physical and non-physical. No, so what I love about is that these mothers, these community workers have taken their own information and use it to engage their mayor, their barangay captains, or different sectoral allies, in order to push for changes such as increased internet connection, changes with the local transport connections in the area, and are now using that same information to plan and brainstorm for possible youth-related projects to ensure that the kids who have not been able to go back to school, have more productive means of engagement beyond youth gangs. So what we're hoping with this kind of pilot, which we hope to be able to scale in a larger way after the current Delta wave, is that we're able to popularize a process of broader service delivery that is not just top-down, militarized, securitized, but factors in the different community knowledges and relationships that should contribute to a democratic process. So yeah, that's where we're at, and thank you so much for giving us the time to share.
Okay, thank you so much, Ika. We don't have Joshua, right? Like, I think have we lost Joshua? Yeah.
Lost him completely now. Hindi na
Oh,
talaga
no.
siya. He can't connect anymore. Excuse me.
Oh man. Well, see, another thing that needs to be democratized in the Philippines. Anyway, so I'm looking at the Q&A. Don't have some questions yet, but I do have a bunch of questions, and I'd also like to invite the panelists to engage with each other. So I was picking up on something Joshua said actually, which was that the coverage of collective bargaining agreements is really low for transport workers. And I know that he kind of addressed this in his bit, but I'm just curious, could you give us a bit more context for why this is the case? Like, where is it something that, is it a hesitation on the part of the workers? Is it just structurally difficult for them to access these forms of collective bargaining?
I can attempt to answer it, but Kuya Joshua can be the best person for
Yeah.
it. But I think in terms of the transport community at Sharms, it's a very informal sector, and technically they don't have employers. but they have transport operators. And these operators are individuals with their agreements with their workers. So in the context of the transport worker community, for example, it's hard to create collective bargaining agreements because you don't really have a common employer in the first place, where you can demand rights and you can, ask for better conditions. So for that particular context, the relief for them to be able to change the boundary system is really trying to pass legislation and policies in the government. There's really no way they can argue and do it on individual employee-employer basis because they don't have a common employer. But through the institution that should be regulating and supporting the public transportation community, which is in this case the government.
Thanks, Haya. The next question I had was for Ken, actually, while waiting for other people. So Ken, you mentioned, the heavy investment in cars, and that seems to be our conception of modernization and progress. But then you also suggested that for some areas that aren't in Metro Manila, there might be slightly more promising trajectories. Would you be able to talk us through, like, counter examples perhaps, or like other like local examples of when the trajectory might be a bit different, and what did people do in that case that we might be able to replicate?
Certainly, thank you. Two examples come to mind. The first example is in Iloilo City, one of the most progressive active transport cities. Probably, I think they deserve to be called the bike capital of the Philippines because they've been truly strong in this. And I think part of that was really strong people participation. And we were talking a lot with some of the Iloilo activists, I was in a forum with one of the Iloilo activists who actually became one of the champions in their local council to push for better, bike lanes, to push for better esplanades, as opposed to putting expressways or things like elevated monstrosities of concrete that belong to the 1970s. And part of that was strong people participation. I give you another emerging example. This is very close to home because it is actually home in Naga City, where we're actually actively challenging many of the current designs, and local activists and environmental movements have been pushing to update our street guides because our public works department has been widening roads
I think we're losing Ken for... Okay, he's back.
widening roads while cutting trees. And our city is one of the most vulnerable to that.
Wait, I think we've lost Ken.
Yeah.
Ken, try turning off your camera. It might be easier if audio.
Okay. Hello.
Okay, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Hello.
Go, Ken.
There you go. So I think I was talking about the Naga City example. And you have, many local environmental activists and active transport advocates who are actively changing local road design for very specific streets where our public works department just wants to widen the road and remove and cut trees, as opposed to incorporating trees in our in the actual design of a complete street that protects biodiversity, that protects the environment, saves us from the harmful impacts of the climate crisis. So a lot of it is highly local. And the function of the national movement, like Move as One, is to encourage more local examples and to form as a support group for these local movements. We've been training a lot of new active transport advocates, for example, in different localities through our Young Mobility Leaders program, which Haya also helped build. So we're excited about these programs. We think this is a more sustainable way to get the movement going at both the local and the national levels. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. That's great. Because also, I want us to continue to subscribe to a politics of hope. So these positive examples are really helpful. Okay, on that note, actually, so Ika, your work, your team's work is a community mapping of of specific project sites, right? Would you be able to maybe expound on the value of area studies or area analysis in this context?
Okay, thanks for the question, Sharmila. Definitely, it's something that we're hoping that more communities can do to have a very grounded spatial approach to this kind of work and even activism. So while Ken and Haya are sharing about important work on the transport sector, there's also value in having going back to a very grounded and neighborhood-based perspective, which she connects how people work and live and deal with issues, no, within their neighborhoods at the level of the street, no. It also, because right now there's a cognitive disconnect between service delivery and actual geographic conditions, which is something that is happening in government. And so shifting it back to a more place-based street-level approach changes that and forces local leaders to be more accountable to people on the street, literally and figuratively. So I think that's one way of one value of this kind of approach. The only challenge is that it forces you to also think in terms of multiple layers and sectors, not just one sector at a time.
Thank you, Ika. Haya, I also have a question for you. So you spoke a lot about the boundary system being really unjust. Maybe just, especially for those who have just joined us, you could elaborate on what the boundary system is exactly and what the challenges are that you faced in dismantling it.
Okay. I think the boundary system on its very core is really the dependence of income on the number of passengers that our transport workers are carrying. So sorry, my father is moving. So for example, in the pre-pandemic, if your jeepney has 20 units capacity, to carry 20 people, times 8 pesos, so you're going to earn 160 pesos per trip one way. But if we are in a pandemic where we're working at a 50% capacity, we're looking at 10 seats times 8 pesos, so we're looking at half the income. But unfortunately, for a lot of individuals in the transport community, they have trouble making ends meet. So before the pandemic, so given the 50% physical distancing, it was difficult for them to ply the roads and make a living for themselves. So what we're advocating is to change it and to reform it via the service contracting system, where they're going to reserve a guaranteed stable income regardless of the number of passengers they carry. So they don't have to work for an inhumane 21 hours of labor just to be able to take home $16 or $20 every day. Instead, in the service contracting, you only have to work for 8 hours. You mean normal, sane, 8 hours of labor to be able to make it to more than minimum, twice the minimum wage actually right now with the way the program works. So we were able to successfully lobby a 5.58 billion peso budget for it in the COVID response budget, and an additional 3 billion pesos in the national budget. So that's around 8 billion pesos, right? Unfortunately, this is a huge win because this is a system and it is a reform that is trying to dismantle a 7-decade system, the boundary system, since the 19 somethings, right? But unfortunately, there are still implementational issues. And as a sectors, for example, the fight doesn't end with us being able to lobby for that particular budget and to lobby for that particular policy. We need to engage the implementation too. And unfortunately, what happened in 2021 was the transport agencies were not letting us enter and co-design the implementation of the program we lobbied for. So it was difficult for us to be able to tell them that, hey, girl, you're doing it wrong. Because a lot of the things they're doing comes from a very engineering point of view, a very, legal lawyer point of view. We're in, okay, let's talk about contracts. Let's talk about, these are the requirements in order for you to avail of the program. But in fact, the goal is for you to be able to engage as much transport workers as possible. So that means trying to waive off some of the legal requirements to make it easier for informal transport workers to actually join the program. And that would only happen, right, if the insight, if the guidelines, if the way it's being run came with feedback from the sectors who are actually experiencing and participating in the program. Another thing that also happened is, I think a lot of the way they approach things was so legal, in a way that they were supposed to pay our transport workers weekly, a weekly salary, so the weekly thing. But because of a lot of bureaucratic issues, some of them had delayed payments for at least 3 months. And in those 3 months, that's a huge slap in the face for transport workers who were used to getting wages every day during their hard labor. A lot of them were heavily in debt. And it was the cooperatives, it was the transport communities, our leaders on the ground who was paying off from their personal money to be able to encourage their transport worker members to still participate in the program. But these sacrifices were not valued as much by transport agencies, which we hope to change coming into the 2022 implementation.
Thanks, Haya. Okay, this question, I think it's just begging to be asked. We have major elections coming up in May next year. So for the sectors that you are working with, what are the forms of engagement with the electoral system that you think can be done, right? Or have already been done, or that you are doing? So in terms of perhaps mobilizing support for particular candidates, or interest articulation of your sector in relation to specific local candidates or candidates for national posts. I'm just very curious to see what that's looking like, because it seems like lobbying is a really big part of, at least for the transport sector. But Ika, even for the urban poor sector, I'm quite curious as well. So anyone, what's it like in light of the upcoming elections?
Go, Atika.
It's a very interesting time because, in the Philippines, election season just started this week with the candidates, announcing their positions. And so definitely the urban poor networks are among the most courted, certainly by many candidates. And so it's going to be a battleground for many reasons. No, so many of the networks we work with are organized. They are parent leaders of different anti-poverty programs, and so we completely commiserate with the kinds of pressures that are coming down to bear on these families. No, so but at the same time, I think more than ever with the pandemic, it has raised the consciousness of people about the link between good leadership and service delivery. And I think that kind of question is not a problem for the urban poor. If you look at the data from our surveys, most people who vote for populist leaders belong to the ABC classes, not the urban poor. And so, but this is nevertheless is going to be very, very interesting because not necessarily in Pasig, but in other municipalities, for example, which we've worked in, we're familiar with how vote banking, for the most part, is tied to tenure security for many urban poor communities. No, if you don't vote for this particular person, your homes will be burned down tomorrow. Or if we don't vote for this person, we will withhold aid. Many of these communities have not been vaccinated. Vaccination is going to be a major carrot for many communities across the Philippines, not just in Metro Manila. So definitely similar to how transport and food security are, happen at the level of the street, the elections will also be fought with these kinds of questions. And honestly, it's going to be very, very challenging the next 6 months for everyone. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Thank you. Ken or Haya?
Go, Ken.
I have been voluntold. The key, what we're actually prioritizing our election mobilization in the coalition, and the way we think about it is, we've been so immersed in the operations that it's very clear who among the representatives who among the candidates really are for the reforms that we're pushing. I think that's something that's super clear if we're as immersed, because we're a large coalition, and we're positioning ourselves to be a strong electoral force, where we'll really engage all the candidates. In fact, we already have a draft of a letter that we're sending all the candidates, requesting for a briefing for each of them, and demanding, essentially, that these reforms be in their platforms, and that will be a key action that we think will be very effective in informing our sectors, and informing our organization members about how committed these candidates really are. And I think one interesting thing that has developed over the past year of lobbying was we've broadened our coalition to actually have broad political support. We have broader political support, at least in the House, in the lower house, where the representation is at the district level. And both minority and majority representatives are pushing for a better budget next year. We see that as a good sign. Even among the Senate, even members who are, strange bedfellows are pushing for the reforms that we're advocating, which is really interesting. But what will spell the difference, I think, is how sincere and committed they are in the briefings that we'll conduct. And how much they really plan on genuinely engaging our sector, because we can fight for all the budgets that we want. But as I have mentioned, if we're not included and we're not a valued member of that governance, then these programs will not be as successful as we want them to be. And these reforms will not be as life-changing as the sectors want it to be. So those are maybe two key actions that we're taking. We are making transport an election issue that no politician can ignore. And we're excited.
Yeah. You have
make it
140 orgs. They have to listen, right? Haya. Yes, Haya,
Yeah, I
please.
wanted to add to ate, parang, what do you call that? Part of coalition organizing, more than like our engagement with transport, for example, is really trying to engage and deepen the democratic processes where citizens can participate. So beyond our transport agenda, that's really what we're doing, right? It's making sure that democratic spaces are accessible for any sector who plans to engage in that who plans to engage the process. So that's what Ken, Ate Ziza, Ate Abby, and many others are actually working. They're convening the People's Budget Coalition, where they can engage in one of the many democratic process, which is like budget work. And I think more than anything else, we're seeing a rise and subtle shifts, right? We're looking at maybe in the future a bigger, stronger shift, but we're looking at the incremental changes and shifts in the way citizens and Filipinos participate in democracy. And I think more than anything else, we're seeing a rise and subtle shifts, right? We're looking at incremental changes and shifts in the way citizens and Filipinos participate in democracy. And Like, it's not just voting, voting won't, it's not the ultimate exercise of democracy. And then after voting, we see a lot of coalitions and organizations, dispel. They're gone. They're not there anymore. Because usually they unite and form coalitions because of elections and then dispel right after. So what happens is agendas, sectors, a lot of them aren't given the platform and a chance to advocate for the things they need and the things they want without those particular channels present anymore. So what we're doing in Move as One Coalition is to create a coalition that isn't just there because of elections, but is there because of genuine agenda, which is the mobility reform. We were formed as a COVID response, and we're not looking forward to dispelling after 2022 elections. We're still gonna be here, hopefully with funding, with more funding and support. So hello po, if you want to fund someone, we can be funded. But yes, and we're still gonna be here, hopefully in the next administrations until we get the mobility and the access that we all deserve in the Philippines.
Thanks, Haya. I think you make a very good point that we can't limit our political imagination to elections alone. Like, it has to be broader than that, and these participatory processes need to, be sustained after elections. Okay, we are nearing our last 5 minutes actually. So what I will do is just invite each speaker to provide any concluding remarks you'd like to share. Perhaps, so one question I had, but we don't need to focus on this, was, and you've touched on it already in your portions, how COVID has exacerbated the conditions within your sector, but also, does it represent any opportunities for change? Like, were there particular conversations that, weren't really happening, but because of COVID have become more visible, or, space has been created for them, or any structures that came about as a result? Like, Haya, you mentioned this whole movement is in some ways a response. We have lost Ika. So I'm going to go back, to Haya and Ken first, if anyone wants to speak to that, or just generally conclude your section.
Hello, Ken. Oh, Ate Ika is here. Go, Ate Ika.
I don't know if Ika heard my question.
Oh, Ate Ika.
Yeah, sorry, what's the question? Just kick me out.
No worries, Ika. I was like, any concluding remarks, but also if you would like to speak to, we've heard about like the heightened vulnerabilities as a result of COVID, but has COVID in some ways created any space for conversations that were difficult to have before, or any structures that can allow, that there are opportunities or entry points to make things better in the sector you're working at as well? Don't have to answer that though. Could also just do concluding remarks.
But yes and no, actually. Okay. Has it created space? Has it made things easier to discuss? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that at this point we're really at rock bottom or close to it, and so it's become it's cleared away some of the barriers to discussing a lot of these issues, no? For example, so frankly speaking, working on human rights issues at the same time as, social protection programs, no? Things that were harder to discuss in 2017 or 2018 are more, matter of fact right now in this space. But at the same time, elections are coming in. So that creates another layer of difficulty where, yes, we can talk about it now. We have the distance to discuss it in a more frank manner. But do we have the political space to do something about it when people are now going to be busy until May, 2022? At the same time, because people are still stuck in their homes, barely eking by, do we have the mental and emotional capacity to actually do something about it? So in a way, from the sectors I work in, both in Manila and elsewhere, it's like right now everything is a preparatory process leading up to May, but also preparatory for everything that happens after May. Knowing that the battles on transport, on housing rights, on land tenure, these will have to be done. Probably like 3 months after a new president is is installed, and then the fight begins again. So it's just a constant cycle of engagement, research, work, and making sure people stay alive, basically.
Thank you. Any of Ken or Haya?
Go,
Haya?
Ken.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry,
Go,
Haya.
go, Ken. Go, Ken.
Unmuted to volunteer,
Sige,
Ken.
sige.
Okay.
Sure. I think it wasn't COVID-19 that gave the opportunity. It was people responding to COVID-19. I think the for me, for example, it was a very personal story why I got into this entire organizing, why I consider that this job as my priority. Essentially, shifting all of my professional goals to align with the COVID-19 response and organizing. It was because as soon as the lockdown came, I had many healthcare workers who are rural healthcare workers here in the Bicol region. My family members couldn't get their personal protective equipment. I have lots of loved ones who are in hospitals who are finding it difficult to get to work and do not get the protection that they deserve from this government. And that's why we're not just organizing because we like it. We're organizing to survive. And that spells, I think the difference between life and death for our loved ones. That's how deep the urge is and the drive is to make things work. And I think when that is, we have skin in the game. Our loved ones' lives are literally on the line. And when this is the driving force, it opens up a window where people can empathize with one another because people are experiencing the same thing. And that was the window. It wasn't a political window. It was a window of empathy that opened because all of us were suddenly experiencing the same thing. And it's not just in transport, it's in budget transparency, in many of the other movements that we're organizing. That is also the common call. You have a common experience. COVID is terrible. This government is terrible. And we have to do something about it. And this government, which is tyrannical and authoritarian, always likes to say that citizens lack discipline. But what I think we saw over the past year of organizing these newer democratic spaces is that's absolutely false. Filipinos, when given the chance to help, will help, but it needs a system. It needs leaders who will allow all of us to help and draw out our strengths to be able to fight for our loved ones' lives.
Thanks, Ken. This has been characterized by many in our generation as literally the fight of our lives this time. So yeah, absolutely. Haya, did you want to, make any concluding comments?
It's hard to conclude this section. But I think I agree with a lot of the things that Ate Ika and Ken said. It's really about surviving now. And I think a lot of the systemic issues we have noticed before and choose to ignore are just so in your face right now. Like, we know that the education system is shitty, but it's different when you see it transfer to distance learning, right? We know that the public transportation system needs further support and investment, but it's different when there's a public transportation ban and when our commuters are literally struggling to get to their workplaces. We know that the healthcare system in the Philippines is problematic, but it's different when you see it collapsing within your eyes, with many of your loved ones dying in the process. We know a lot of these things needed to change a long time ago, and there have been efforts to change this, but many of these efforts are incremental because it's not an emergency, because there are many things under the sun that we need to fix, because there are many other priorities like build like having an airport, many of the different priorities which, looking back, are unnecessary and do not really contribute much to improving the life of ordinary Filipinos, are not really critical social services. I think right now with the pandemic, we've seen which services and which sectors actually are are critical and which needs majority of our investments. And definitely it is not build. Definitely it is about infrastructure that's pro people. Definitely it's about better social services for the poor and social security. And definitely it's about a better general healthcare service system for everyone in the Philippines. Thanks, Ate Charms.
Thank you. So thank you very much to everyone on this panel for doing such great work and for being generous with your time and sharing that here. Hopefully, more collaborations come out of this engagement. We're going to have to end here because our time is up. I encourage everyone else who's watching to continue on and participate in the next scheduled activity of the forum. And we will see you all online, hopefully in person someday soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye,
Charms.
Ate Charms. Thank you po.
Bye.
Bye-bye.